The December wind cut through Manhattan like a blade made of ice and regret. Claire Bennett pulled her worn coat tighter around her shoulders as she positioned herself at the corner of Fifth Avenue, where the golden lights of the Sterling Grand Hotel spilled onto the frozen sidewalk. Inside those walls, champagne flowed like water and diamonds caught the light of crystal chandeliers. Out here, she counted quarters in her glove and prayed her fingers would not freeze before she earned enough for Owen's medication. Her keyboard was ancient, battery-powered, and temperamental in the cold. She had carried it 6 blocks on the subway with Owen's small hand gripping her sleeve the entire way. Now he sat on the folded blanket beside her, his headphones covering his ears, his eyes fixed on the game console that kept the world at a manageable distance. Claire pressed the first key and let the music rise into the night air, soft and searching, like a question whispered to the dark. Inside the Sterling Grand, Julien Hartwell stood near the bar with a glass of scotch he had not touched and a smile he had perfected over a decade of board meetings and investor calls. The gala was for childhood literacy, a cause his company sponsored every year with the kind of generosity that made headlines and tax breaks. He wore a suit that cost more than most people earned in a month, and he wore his indifference even better. Beside him, Natasha Vale laughed at something a senator said, her hand resting possessively on Julian's arm like a brand. She was beautiful in the way expensive things are beautiful, polished and perfect and utterly without warmth. They had been engaged for 8 months, an arrangement that pleased investors and families alike. Julien told himself that love was for people who could afford to be reckless, and he had stopped being reckless the day his brother disappeared. The memory came without permission, as it always did. Thomas with his guitar and his terrible jokes, Thomas who wrote songs in the margins of textbooks and fell in love like other people caught colds. Thomas who vanished one autumn night 15 years ago, leaving nothing behind but questions that turned into silence. The melody breaks through. Julien heard the music before he understood what it meant. The sound drifted through the hotel's revolving doors each time someone entered, faint and fragile against the noise of the gala. He would have ignored it entirely if not for the pattern of notes that moved through him like a key turning in a lock he thought he had thrown away. His hand tightened around the glass until his knuckles went white. The scotch sloshed but did not spill. Natasha turned to him with a question in her eyes, but he was already moving toward the entrance, his heart hammering against his ribs with a violence that felt like panic and recognition tangled together. Outside, the cold hit him like a fist, but he barely felt it. His eyes found the woman at the keyboard, her fingers moving with a grace that seemed impossible for someone playing on a street corner in winter. She was younger than he expected, with dark hair that fell across her face and eyes that stayed fixed on the keys as if looking up might shatter her concentration. Beside her, a small boy rocked gently back and forth, his hands pressed over his headphones, his mouth moving in silent counting. The melody continued, each note landing exactly where Thomas had written it all those years ago in a hospital room where their mother lay dying. It was the last thing Thomas had created before he left, a composition he claimed was for the girl he loved, the one he swore would change everything. Julien had heard it only once, played on an old guitar while their mother slept, and he had forbidden Thomas from ever finishing it, afraid the emotion would break what little control they had left. When eyes finally meet, Claire felt the weight of someone watching before she saw him. Her fingers stumbled on a chord, and the mistake rang out sharp and wrong in the winter air. She looked up and found a man standing 3 feet away, staring at her as if she were a ghost that had stepped out of his nightmares. He was tall and expensively dressed, with eyes that held the kind of pain people spent fortunes trying to hide. Owen sensed the change in her breathing and pulled his headphones down, his body going rigid with the fear that always came when strangers moved too close. Claire's hand found his shoulder immediately, a touch meant to reassure, but her own pulse was racing too fast for comfort. The man spoke, and his voice was rough with something that sounded like grief. He asked where she learned that song, and the question fell between them like a stone thrown into still water. Claire's throat went dry. She had not spoken Thomas's name aloud in 8 years, not since the night she stood in the rain outside his apartment and realized he was never coming back. She told the stranger it was something personal, something private, and she needed him to leave. But Julien did not move. He asked again, quieter this time, with a desperation that made her fingers go cold on the keys. He said the song was written by someone he lost, someone who never should have known how to write music that beautiful because he was too reckless and too young and too gone to have left anything behind worth remembering. Claire stood up so quickly the keyboard nearly toppled. Owen grabbed her hand and pressed himself against her side, his breathing already starting to quicken with panic. She told the stranger he was wrong, that the song was hers, that he needed to walk away before she called for help. But Julien was already reaching into his coat, pulling out his phone, his hands shaking as he found the photo he had carried for 15 years. He turned the screen toward her, and Claire's entire world stopped breathing. The face looking back at her from that photo was Thomas Reed, younger and laughing, with his arm around the shoulders of the man now standing in front of her. The caption beneath read simply, "My brother, my best friend, always." Claire's legs nearly gave out beneath her. The phone screen glowed in the darkness, and Thomas's face smiled back at her across the years like a wound that had never properly healed. Owen tugged at her coat, sensing her distress, his small voice breaking through in fragmented syllables that only she could understand. She pulled him closer, her mind racing through impossible calculations. This man, this stranger in his expensive suit and haunted eyes, was Thomas's brother. The brother Thomas had mentioned only twice, always with a tension in his voice that suggested complicated history and unfinished business. Julien watched her reaction with the focus of someone reading a verdict. He saw the recognition bloom and then shatter across her face, saw the way her hand instinctively protected the boy at her side. He asked her name, and when she whispered it, Claire Bennett, he closed his eyes as if the sound had physically struck him. Thomas had written that name in the margins of sheet music, had said it like a prayer during those final weeks before he vanished. Julien had thought it was just another of his brother's fleeting obsessions, another person Thomas would love intensely and then leave behind when the next adventure called. Claire found her voice, though it came out shakier than she wanted. She asked how this was possible, how Julien could be here now after all these years of silence. She had searched for Thomas until her savings ran dry and her hope turned to dust. She had called hospitals and police stations, had stood outside his last known address until a neighbor told her the family had moved away without leaving forwarding information. And then Owen had been born, and survival had required her to stop looking backward. The story Thomas never told. Julien gestured toward the hotel lobby, suggesting they talk somewhere warm, somewhere away from the street and the cold that was making Owen shiver despite his layers. Claire hesitated, every instinct telling her to grab her son and disappear into the subway tunnels before this conversation could destroy what little peace she had built. But Owen was cold, and the truth was standing in front of her wearing Thomas's eyes, and she found herself nodding. Inside the hotel, Natasha appeared like a storm dressed in silk and fury. She demanded to know why Julien had abandoned the gala, why he was bringing homeless people into the lobby, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Claire felt the familiar burn of shame rise in her chest, the same feeling she had carried through 1,000 judgments from 1,000 strangers who looked at her second-hand clothes and single motherhood and saw only failure, but Julien turned to Natasha with a coldness that made even the hotel staff step back. He told her to return to the gala alone, that something important had come up, something that did not concern her. Natasha's face went pale with anger, but she was smart enough to recognize when she had lost control of a situation. She left with a final warning that they would discuss his embarrassing behavior later, her heels clicking against marble like gunshots. Julien led them to a private lounge off the main lobby, a room normally reserved for VIP guests. He ordered hot chocolate for Owen and coffee for Claire, though her hands shook too much to lift the cup when it arrived. Owen sat pressed against his mother's side, his eyes darting between the expensive furniture and the man who carried his father's face in older, sadder lines. The brother's confession. Julien began talking, and the story that emerged was nothing like what Claire had imagined during all those years of silence. Thomas had not abandoned her by choice. He had been driving home from her apartment the night he disappeared, his head full of plans for their future and the melody he had just finished composing. A drunk driver had run a red light at the intersection of Columbus and 68th. The impact had sent Thomas's car spinning into a concrete barrier. He had survived, but barely. Claire's coffee cup slipped from her numb fingers, and only Julien's quick reflexes kept it from shattering on the table. He continued, his voice flat with the kind of pain that had turned to stone over years of carrying it alone. Thomas had been in a coma for 6 weeks. When he finally woke, he had no memory of the months leading up to the accident. The doctors said it was traumatic amnesia, that the memories might return or might stay buried forever. Their father, a man who had always valued control above all else, had made a decision. He had moved Thomas to a private facility upstate, away from the city and everything that might remind him of the life he had lost. He had told the doctors not to push for memory recovery, afraid that forcing Thomas to remember the accident might break him entirely. And he had forbidden Julien from contacting anyone from Thomas's old life, insisting it would only confuse and hurt his recovering son. Julien had been 23 and still trapped under his father's authority, still believing that obedience was the same as love. By the time Julien had grown strong enough to question those decisions, 2 years had passed. He had hired investigators to find the people Thomas had mentioned in his confused moments of waking. But Claire had moved multiple times, had changed her phone number, had disappeared into the vast anonymity of people trying to survive in a city that did not care about their stories. The trail had gone cold, and Julien had convinced himself that perhaps his father had been right, that some doors were better left closed. Owen's silent question. Claire sat frozen as the truth rearranged everything she thought she knew about her past. Thomas had not chosen to leave. He had not decided she was not worth fighting for. He had been stolen by circumstance and a father's misguided protection, lost to an accident and a silence that had grown too heavy to break. The anger she had carried for 8 years began to crack, and beneath it was a grief so old and deep she had forgotten how to feel it fully. Owen pulled at her sleeve, his eyes wide with a question he could not form into words. Claire looked down at her son, at the dark curls that matched the ones in Julien's photo, at the sensitive spirit that startled at loud noises and found peace only in music. She had never told Owen much about his father, only that he had loved them but could not stay. Now the truth was more complicated and more painful than any story she could have invented. Julien watched the boy with an expression that shifted between wonder and sorrow. He asked how old Owen was, though the math was already written plainly across his face. Claire told him 8, and Julien nodded slowly. He said that Thomas was alive, that he lived in a care facility in the Hudson Valley, that he had regained most of his functions but his memory remained fractured. Some days he remembered their childhood clearly, other days he could not recall his own name. He had never married, never moved on, existing in a strange space between past and present. The question hung unspoken in the air between them. Did Thomas deserve to know about Owen, about the son he never knew existed? Did Owen deserve to meet a father who might not remember being in love, who might look at Claire with polite confusion instead of recognition? And what right did Julien have to make those decisions, having already failed them once by staying silent for so long? The photograph that changes everything. Claire reached into her bag with trembling hands and pulled out her wallet. Inside, protected by plastic that had yellowed with age, was a single photograph. It showed her and Thomas on a bench in Central Park, his guitar across his lap, her head on his shoulder, both of them laughing at something the camera had not captured. She had taken it on a disposable camera 3 weeks before he disappeared. It was the only proof she had that their love had been real and not just a dream she had invented to make sense of her loneliness. Julien took the photo carefully, as if it might dissolve under his touch. His eyes filled with tears he did not bother to hide. He said it was the happiest he had ever seen his brother, that Thomas had spent his whole life chasing feelings he could never quite name. And here, in this faded photograph, he had clearly found what he was looking for. Owen reached up and touched the photo, his finger landing on Thomas's face. He looked at Julien and then at his mother, and though he could not say the words, the question in his eyes was clear. Claire pulled him close and whispered against his hair that yes, this was his father, and yes, everything was about to change. Outside, snow had begun to fall, dusting the city in white that would turn gray by morning. Inside the private lounge, 3 people sat with the weight of the past pressing down on them, trying to figure out how to build a bridge between what was lost and what might still be saved. Julien made a decision then, pulling out his phone to make a call that would set everything in motion. He told Claire that tomorrow, if she was willing, he would take them to see Thomas. He could not promise recognition or reunion, but he could give them the chance to try. Claire looked at Owen, at the hope beginning to bloom in her son's dark eyes, and she knew there was only one answer she could give. They would go, and they would face whatever waited at the end of that journey. Together, morning arrived with the kind of clarity that only comes after snowfall, when the world looks clean and full of possibility. Claire barely slept, her mind cycling through 1,000 scenarios of what the day might bring. Owen had woken twice during the night, his small body tense with an excitement he could not voice. She had held him and hummed the melody that always calmed him, the same tune Thomas had written all those years ago, never knowing it would become the lullaby for his son. Julien arrived at their apartment building in a car so expensive it looked out of place among the cracked sidewalks and corner stores. Claire had dressed Owen in his best clothes, a button-up shirt she had found at a thrift store and pants that were only slightly too short. She wore a simple dress beneath her worn coat, wanting to look presentable but feeling the weight of inadequacy settle over her shoulders like fog. The drive north was quiet at first, the city giving way to suburbs and then to rolling hills covered in snow. Owen sat in the back seat, his nose pressed to the window, watching the landscape change. Julien drove with the focus of someone performing a task that required all his concentration to keep his emotions in check. Finally, Claire broke the silence, asking what Thomas remembered, what pieces of himself he had managed to hold onto through the years of fractured memory. What Thomas became. Julien's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he explained. Thomas had retained his love of music, though he could no longer write new compositions. He played guitar during therapy sessions, old songs from their childhood, familiar melodies that did not require him to reach into the parts of his memory that remained dark. He was gentle with the staff, patient and kind, but there was a sadness in him that never quite lifted. The doctor said he was mourning something he could not name, grieving for a life his conscious mind could not access but his heart somehow remembered. Claire felt tears slip down her cheeks and wiped them away quickly, not wanting Owen to see her cry. She asked if Thomas had ever mentioned her name, if any spark of recognition had surfaced in all these years. Julien admitted that once, about 5 years ago, Thomas had woken from a dream speaking her name. He had been agitated, insisting he needed to find someone, that he had made a promise he needed to keep. But within hours, the clarity had faded, and Thomas had returned to his usual quiet confusion. The care facility appeared as they crested a hill, a beautiful building that looked more like a resort than a medical center. Julien explained that their father had spared no expense, had poured guilt and money into making sure Thomas had every comfort, as if luxury could somehow compensate for the choices that had kept him isolated. Their father had passed away 3 years ago, and Julien had taken over Thomas's care, visiting every week, sitting with a brother who sometimes knew him and sometimes looked at him like a friendly stranger. The meeting. They found Thomas in the music room, a bright space with windows overlooking snow-covered gardens. He sat with a guitar across his lap, his fingers moving through a chord progression that seemed to exist more from muscle memory than conscious thought. He looked older than the photograph, lines around his eyes that spoke of confusion and loss, but his face still held the gentle quality Claire remembered. Julien entered first, and Thomas looked up with a smile of recognition. He greeted his brother warmly, asking about work and commenting on the snow. Then his eyes moved past Julien to where Claire stood in the doorway with Owen's hand gripped tightly in hers. Thomas's fingers went still on the guitar strings. His expression shifted through confusion, then wonder, then something that looked almost like pain. Claire stepped forward slowly, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She said his name, just once, and the sound of her voice seemed to travel through him like an electric current. Thomas stood, the guitar sliding forgotten to the floor. He stared at her with eyes that were trying desperately to connect fragments of memory to the reality standing before him. Owen pressed against his mother's side, suddenly shy in the presence of this stranger who carried his face in older form. Thomas noticed the boy, and his expression transformed into something close to awe. He knelt down slowly, bringing himself to Owen's level, and asked in a voice rough with emotion what the boy's name was. Owen looked up at Claire for permission, and she nodded through her tears. The melody remembers. Owen could not speak the words, but he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small harmonica, a gift from one of Claire's music students. He lifted it to his lips and played the opening notes of the melody Thomas had written 15 years ago. The sound filled the music room, simple and pure, and Thomas's face crumbled as something deep inside him broke open. He reached for the guitar with shaking hands and joined the melody, his fingers finding the chords without conscious thought. Claire watched as muscle memory and emotion combined to unlock what years of therapy had not been able to touch. Thomas played through the entire composition, his eyes never leaving Owen's face, tears streaming down his cheeks as the music connected pieces of his broken memory. When the final note faded, Thomas looked up at Claire and said her name. Not as a question, but as a recognition, as a truth his heart had held onto even when his mind could not. He said he had been looking for her, that he had dreamed of her voice and woken with an ache he could not explain. He looked at Owen and asked, with a vulnerability that shattered every defense Claire had built, if this beautiful boy was his son. Claire knelt beside them both, and Owen moved into the space between his parents without hesitation. She told Thomas yes, that Owen was his son, that she had searched for him until she had nothing left to search with. She told him about the pregnancy, about the years of raising Owen alone, about the melody she had kept alive because it was the only piece of him she had left. Thomas listened with his hand on Owen's shoulder, grounding himself in the reality of this child, this proof that his lost love had been real. Natasha's final play. The moment of peace shattered when Natasha appeared in the doorway, having tracked Julien through his driver. She took in the scene with cold calculation, seeing immediately how this reunion threatened everything she had built. She announced that Julien needed to return to the city immediately, that investors were waiting, that this emotional detour was jeopardizing important deals. But Julien stood and faced her with a certainty he had not felt in years. He told her their engagement was over, that he had been living a life designed by other people's expectations, and he was done pretending it was enough. Natasha's composure cracked, revealing the anger beneath her polished exterior. She threatened legal action, public humiliation, everything her position and connections could bring to bear. Julien remained calm. He told her she could do whatever she felt necessary, but nothing would change his decision. He had spent 15 years living with the guilt of not fighting for his brother's happiness. He would not make that mistake again. Natasha left with threats hanging in the air like poison, but her power over him had already dissolved. Building tomorrow. The afternoon stretched into evening as Thomas, Claire, and Owen sat together in the music room, building a bridge across 8 years of separation. Thomas's memory remained fragmented, but emotion filled the gaps where facts could not reach. He remembered the feeling of loving Claire even if he could not recall every specific moment. He looked at Owen and saw a second chance at the life that had been stolen from him. Julien made arrangements for Thomas to transition to outpatient care, to move into an apartment where Claire and Owen could visit freely. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, noting that emotional connection sometimes succeeded where medical interventions failed. They warned that Thomas might never recover all his memories. That some doors might remain permanently closed. But as Claire watched Thomas and Owen play a simple duet together, she realized that perfect memory mattered less than present love. As night fell over the Hudson Valley, the four of them stood at the window watching snow continue to blanket the world in white. Owen had fallen asleep against Thomas's shoulder, his breathing deep and even in a way Claire rarely saw. Thomas held his son with the careful reverence of someone holding something precious and fragile. Julien stood beside Claire, and she thanked him for his courage in finally breaking the silence that had kept them apart. The promise of new beginnings. 3 months later, Claire performed at a small recital hall in Manhattan, her first public concert in nearly a decade. Thomas sat in the front row with Owen, both of them watching her with identical expressions of pride and love. Julien had helped arrange the event, using his connections not to control but to create opportunities. The music that night was the melody Thomas had written, expanded and refined, transformed from a fragment of grief into a full composition of hope. Owen had begun speaking more, his confidence growing with the stability of having both parents present in his life. Thomas's memory continued to improve slowly, pieces returning in unexpected moments. He might never remember everything, but he remembered enough. He remembered the feeling of falling in love with a girl who played piano like she was having a conversation with heaven. He remembered writing a melody for her in a hospital room while his mother slept. And every day, he built new memories with the family he had lost and found again. Claire finished her performance to standing applause, but the only faces she saw were Thomas and Owen, her past and her future sitting side by side. After the concert, they walked together through the city where their story had begun and nearly ended. Owen held both their hands, swinging between them, his laughter ringing out clear and unafraid. The melody that had brought them together now played in the background of their daily life, a reminder that some things survive even when memory fails. Love, it turned out, had its own language, its own way of calling people home. And sometimes, second chances came dressed as a song played on a winter night, as recognition that moved faster than thought, as the courage to finally speak truths that had been buried too long beneath silence and fear. They were not perfect, this reconstructed family. Thomas still had difficult days when his memory clouded and confusion returned. Claire still worried about money and the future. Owen still struggled with words when anxiety rose. But they faced those challenges together now, and that made all the difference. The billionaire who had learned that wealth meant nothing without connection. The street pianist who had discovered her music could still move mountains. The boy who found his voice through his father's returned love. And the man who woke each day grateful for a second chance he never expected to receive. Their story became the kind people whispered about in concert halls and coffee shops, a reminder that some melodies never die, they just wait for the right moment to be heard again. The end.